Even amongst MBA programs, Wharton is known as the finance school. And so today, what I wanted to do is share in great detail what one of the most popular finance classes at Wharton is like, advanced topics in private equity. What I thought was really cool about this class is that my professor was Dan Zilberman, the former head of Europe and the current global head of capital solutions at Warburg Pincus. So we were learning from an actual seasoned PE investor. Warburg is one of the top private equity firms in the entire world, and I recently interviewed one of my classmates who worked at the firm, which you can check out later if you're interested. Going over today's agenda, I'll first provide an overview of the class's structure, then go over 5 key lessons I learned about private equity, and lastly, walk you through the model that I built for the class. Okay, so first up, let me go over the class's structure. What I immediately liked about this class is that during the entire semester, we go through an actual deal that Warburg has worked on when it acquired a company called the Mutual Fund Store back in 2011. In one of the first few classes, the professor brought in the former CEO of the Mutual Fund Store, who gave us a management presentation and overview of the company, which is something that's very, very common in the private equity world as well. The following classes then focused on how private equity investors perform due diligence on a business, and we were given data room access with tons of information on things like financials, legal, human capital, market sizing, sales and marketing, and a whole lot more. We then used what we learned from our diligence to drive assumptions for financial models that we built, and we built an LBO, DCF, and also comps. And then at the end, we put everything together in a PowerPoint presentation and went through a simulated kind of investment committee where we were defending our assumptions to our professor, who really did not go easy on us. Intermixed amongst all these classes were also guest speakers who were extremely interesting to listen to, including a partner from Hellman and Friedman and the co-head of PE at Centerbridge Partners. So that was how the class was structured, and I thought it was just a really interesting way to learn about private equity as opposed to just having the professor just lecture us throughout the entire semester. And if you're actually interested in breaking into private equity, you're definitely going to want to check out the recently announced private equity certificate program being offered by Wharton and Wall Street Prep. This program is sponsored by top firms like Blackstone, Carlyle, and KKR. And over 8 weeks, you can learn at your own pace through this online course that's taught by Wharton professors, Wall Street Prep's PE program director, and real PE investors, including David Rubenstein, the founder of Carlyle, and Martin Brand, the head of North America PE at Blackstone, who will cover topics like the PE deal process, valuation, how to think like a private equity professional, and more. By completing the program, you also unlock access to the alumni member database, fireside chats with PE investors, and exclusive networking events with the world's top private equity recruiters. This program runs 3 times a year, and if you're interested, be sure to use my code RARELIQUID to get $300 off, and also sign up by the early registration deadline to get an additional $200 off. I'll leave a link to all of this in the description, and I'll also be including a free LBO that you can download and practice around with if you're interested in modeling as well. All right, let's now go into the 5 things I learned about private equity from this class. The first lesson came up from one of our first few lectures where my professor said that one of the dirty secrets about the private equity industry is that a lot of returns have been driven by the rise in exit multiples. A lot of times, 60% of your underwriting case, aka the model that you build and the thesis you have, the projections you have, and all the assumptions, 60% of all of that just could be wrong, but you could still get a good return from your investment just because exit multiples have been increasing. I thought this was such an interesting way to kick off the class because it showed a lot of self-awareness where my professor wasn't saying, even the top private equity investors, it's not that they are just so good at financial engineering a company or improving operations. A lot of times it kind of boils down to luck, which is that multiples have been expanding over the past few decades, which is not really in an investor's control. The second lesson I learned about private equity was also kind of a dirty secret in that a lot of dry powder that private equity firms are put into sometimes subpar or just average investments because private equity firms have to return their capital to investors if they don't spend it. For example, if a private equity firm is able to raise $500 million on, let's say, December 31st, 2024, and promises to deploy the capital in 5 years, the clock starts on January 1st, 2025. And if by December 31st, 2029, $100 million isn't used, then that money is returned to investors. Given that PE investors earn a lot of their compensation through carry, which is basically profits off of the investments that they make, this sometimes can lead to a lot of subpar investments in the private equity industry. And if you're confused about what carry is, or if you want to learn how private equity investors make their money, then feel free to check out this video right here. The third lesson I learned was that in my professor's 25 years of private equity investing, his best ones were carve-outs. Carve-outs are when a typically large company decides to sell off one of its divisions or subsets of its business. And so, for example, let's say that Meta were to sell Instagram or WhatsApp. That would be a carve-out. When a PE firm acquires a carve-out, they're able to unload a lot of capital and resources and management attention to this smaller business that potentially the larger company was just not really paying attention to, and therefore unlock a lot of potential value. Carve-outs are not typically that normal and can be a little bit harder to find because you're going to need to find a company that wants to sell off part of its business. And that's not as common as companies that just want to sell their entire business. The fourth lesson I learned is to never, never, never fall in love with the company during the deal heat. And how do you not fall in love? Proper due diligence. During our class, we got a frankly unrealistic and really fast-tracked experience with diligence where we were just handed a lot of the important, relevant information right away. In a real PE deal, due diligence takes a lot of time and effort. It means going through hundreds and hundreds of rows in Excel and hundreds of potential pages and speaking with consultants, lawyers, customers, and a lot of other stakeholders. My professor said that in a 5-week deal sprint, so let's say there are 5 total people bidding on a company, 4 of them are going to burn millions and millions of dollars on due diligence and not acquire the company. But my professor said that he would much rather burn millions and then not acquire the company versus potentially paying too much for it and or realizing that after spending not enough on due diligence that there are a lot of problems with the company. And that's the last thing you want to avoid is actually acquiring a company and then having it being a really, really bad portfolio company that can really drag returns for the overall fund. The fifth lesson I found really interesting was that from my professor's words, there's only one thing that will ever be true about your financial model, and that is that it will always be wrong. Now, don't get me wrong, models are super, super important in that they help you understand the key drivers of a business and also the financial levers that you can kind of utilize to affect your returns, including things like your valuation, leverage, and your interest rates. With that said, you just never really know how a company is going to perform over the next 5 years and also what kind of macro challenges will be presented to you. And so my professor mentioned that it's always important to have 2 things when making an investment. One is a large TAM or target addressable market, and second is high margins. These 2 things provide a really nice cushion for you just in case things go wrong. All right, now next up, let me walk you through the financial model that our team built for our final project. So here is the model that I want to kind of give you guys a peek into. And I want to be also really clear that this model, I changed up all the numbers, both for the historicals and projections, just to make sure that I'm not kind of giving away any important information. And I just want to show you the structure of what we built because it is a little bit more detailed than I actually expected that we would go into. And that's mainly because a lot of the people who take this class may not actually have finance experience, so they may not have modeled before. And this is something that I built with a bunch of my classmates. And I will say that the people with finance experience were the ones who really built this model. Even though there were about 6 of us, I think like 3 people never even really touched this model. So with that said, here are instructions. I changed up some of the important information here as well. And then we're also given like a rubric for how this will be graded. And then starting off with the assumptions tab, this was the most important tab that we worked on. And I'm not going to go into really what the mutual fund store company does because that's not really the point of this video. And I just want to show you the structure of this model as well, mainly. But anyway, so a lot of the diligence that we did went into creating these assumptions. So things like company store openings, franchise store openings. And as we go down, there's this thing called market appreciation analysis that we had to do, expenses, and then as we go down more, balance sheet assumptions. So as you can see, pretty thorough. There are a lot of assumptions in here, and each time we adjusted any of the assumptions, we basically had to rely on our diligence and the data we were able to look at in order to kind of justify our assumptions. And a lot of this kind of built up to this tab, which was the asset under management buildup. Essentially, another tab of a bunch of assumptions that we had to put together in order to ultimately drive our operating model, which is the next tab. But before we go to that, I know there's like a lot of rows here, but essentially a lot of this information or a lot of the formulas in here, once you set it up correctly, you kind of copy paste it down. So it's not as hard as it may look here. And then we had our operating model, which if you're not really sure what that means, it's basically just your financial statements. And so as you can see here, we basically have an income statement and projections. And then we have our balance sheet here. And then if we go down more, our cash flow statement. And then because we built out an LBO, we also needed a debt schedule. And that all fed into our LBO tab where we had a lot of different kind of sections here. So we had the assumptions, which include things like our entry and exit multiple, our leverage, all of that stuff, purchase price calculation, go down more seller proceeds, goodwill calculation, sources and uses table, pro forma capitalization table. And then as you can see here, our 5-year return analysis. And as I mentioned, don't focus on the numbers. Our IRR is like 70% to 80% because I really fudged up the numbers. But I just wanted to show you guys again what this model kind of looks like. Sponsor cash flows, key KPIs, and then IRR data tables. And then we had a very high level, simple DCF where we just plugged in our projections from our operating model in order to eventually get to our equity value. And then we had comps. So as you can see, a pretty thorough assignment, and it took us a few weeks to kind of work through all of this. And hopefully this is helpful for you to kind of see how all of the work that we put into our diligence and then kind of the classes where we learned about private equity and how to do diligence, all of that kind of fed into this model, which we eventually turned into a PowerPoint presentation and then presented to our professor. All right, so that was the model. And I wanted to also let you guys know something interesting from going through this entire class and diligencing this company, the mutual fund store. So when we looked at this company, basically every single group, because we kind of watched each other's investment committee presentations, all thought that the company was a great company, basically just a slam dunk to invest in. But what actually happened was Warburg Pincus did acquire the company and it did perform well for them, but there were a ton of issues with the company that we just didn't foresee. And so while it seemed like a slam dunk just from kind of the financials, there were a lot of ups and downs with the company. And so I just thought it was super interesting that even if you think that a company is a slam dunk from your due diligence and your modeling, there are so many things that can go wrong. And so it's just you can never really fully be sure about an investment. Okay, so that wraps up the video. And let me know what you guys thought and if you enjoyed this video, because I'm happy to go over the other classes that I really enjoyed during my time at my MBA at Wharton. And on that note, I actually recently announced a How to Get into MBA course that I think is a super great resource if you're interested in getting into a top MBA program. I'll leave a link to it down in the description below. There's a free trial and a money-back guarantee. You can check all of that out. And lastly, in the next screen, you're gonna see a video about the good, the bad, and the ugly aspects of private equity. You can check that out if you're interested in learning more about the industry. With that said, thank you guys all so much for watching. Hope to catch you all in the next video. Thanks guys, and peace out.